If it's going to be such a small group, maybe I'll sit down.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Works. Sure. It is a seminar room, so
Yeah,
I don't know
that's
why
right.
it's
I used to
spinning
teach
the way
seminars,
it
but
is.
didn't stand up.
I didn't screw it in far enough into the. And I'll fix this. I'll edit it later.
You can ask.
Excellent.
Well, I suppose with a title like Torah study and business doing it all on certain income and trust in God, I suppose profession is one of the subjects of the discussion.
I think the concept, not to list so many topics, but to try to integrate.
You know, I didn't choose the topic,
I
and
know.
they didn't even consult with me, so I was as surprised as you are to see what was written there.
If you wanna riff on something else, I'm sure.
No,
we-
no, but I wanted to
Actually,
share with you.
I might have been the instigator, I'm not sure. So I'll tell you what I thought.
Just
if you
culling
like.
words from the various topics I
The
speak
idea of
about.
balancing these.
Yeah. So, there's a very telling passage in the book of Jonah. He's on the boat and the storm ensues and they're desperate and they cast lots to see who's causing the problem. Of course, the lot falls on Jonah. And when it does, the people, the sailors, say, they said to him, Agidon Lolanu, please tell us, Bashelami hara azos lanu, you who are causing this terrible danger to us. Now they ask him 4 questions.
Yeah.
Ma malachtacha, what is your work? Umayayin tavo, where are you coming from? Ma artzacha, what is your home native land? And what people are you from? Now, when you are confronting a person who's up until now a stranger and you ask him questions, you want information about him. The first question they ask, this is 3,000 years ago, the first question they ask is, what is your work? I think that's as modern as today. You meet someone at a party, a cocktail party, whatever it is, you don't know, you say, what do you do? You're not asking him how he spends weekends. What do you do means how do you earn your money? And as a single question, which will reveal more about you than any other question, it's a very telling question. If I know what you do, I know what your education is, I know something about your income bracket, I know something about the kinds of friends you keep, I know something about your avocation, if you're a college professor, or you're a plumber and earn more than the college professor, or you're an airline pilot, I know a lot about you. So it's very natural for them to start with, before what nation you come from, before what your native land is, what is your work? Now listen to Jonah's answer. Vayoma Alehem said to them, Ivri Anochi, I'm a Hebrew, Yes Hashem, Elokei Hashemayim, Ani Yorei, and I am in awe of the Hashem who is the God of the heavens, the one who made the land and the sea. I made the sea, sorry. I didn't see the land. That's all he says.
Yeah.
I mean, Ivri, I stand in awe of the creator of the world. But what about, what's your work?
Doesn't matter. Apparently.
He doesn't even answer that. The message here is, as you said, that it doesn't matter. Now, why doesn't it matter? I just pointed out that in general, it does matter. It does give you a lot of information. Well, let's think of examples. I want you to meet my friend Abraham. Oh, hello, Abraham. How do you earn your living, Abraham? Well, shepherd. Ah, now you know. Now you understand who Abraham is and what his education is and what his goals are. No, you don't. No, you don't. Abraham is the founder of a nationhood and a religion that's going to last thousands of years. You wouldn't guess that from knowing that he was a shepherd, would you?
No. No.
Abraham, Isaac, meet my friend Isaac. Oh, Isaac, what do you do? Well, as a present, I'm a farmer, a fantastically successful farmer. I planted and got 100 times as much produce as what could be expected. Wow, you must be fantastically wealthy, and you must have business enterprises and so on and so on. That's not going to tell you about Isaac, who's prepared to sacrifice his life in the service of God at the Akedah. It's not going to give you a clue to that. And so it goes down through Jewish history. When you talk about a person's profession, Rabbi Yochanan was a shoemaker. Rabbi Lezer was fantastically wealthy. He had ships on all the seas. A business magnate. Are you going to understand who these people are on the basis of their professions? Certainly not. So this message from Yonah is that if you're looking for my profession, you're categorizing me in the wrong way. Now, again, for the third time, it's not a wrong categorization for certain people in certain cultures. No, it's the right categorization. But for us, it isn't so. Why isn't it so? It isn't so because we are firmly focused on profession as a means and not an end. It's a means and not an end. Now, you may think, well, of course, you work in order to earn money, and that's always only a means, and you're going to spend the money on things that you want, but that's not true. It's not true. It ought to be true, but psychologically it's not true. If you ask a person, what are you? Or you ask of a person, what is he? You'll get the answer, a doctor. That's what he is. He's a doctor. He doesn't do doctoring. He is a doctor. A noun carries much more significance than a verb. A verb describes an activity. A noun describes a being. And that's what he identifies with. Ask yourself, what kinds of successes and failures are more important to a person, failure being more threatening? Now, if you play golf on the weekends and suddenly your golf game goes off, that's not pleasant, but you don't feel threatened. If you start failing at your profession, you feel threatened. And by failing, I don't mean that you're going to starve. Last year you earned $2 million, and this year only earned $500,000. So I'm going down, I'm losing it. I'm losing it. Yeah, I'm not starving, but I'm not succeeding. I used to wonder what got Bill Gates out of bed in the morning after he had $20 billion. And then it was $30 billion, then it was $40 billion. Right? Because that's where his identity was invested. So there is a terrible, I wouldn't even say temptation, because temptation is something which you could consciously identify and resist. There's an impulse to identify with your profession. Now, I think this is true for men much more than it is true for women. Yeah.
Am I identifying with my profession, or I chose my profession as an expression of my being?
I hear that.
For some people.
One second, I hear that. Is that my phone? Is it buzzing? Okay. I hear that. In other words, I choose my profession according to something which I already identify.
Which I am.
I think that's right, but I think that the difference will be this. That's a very important comment. The difference will be this: by what measure do you evaluate your performance? Is it the socially accepted norms for success in that measure, in that activity, or is it the personally defined goals in the activity and the way in which you realize the goals you set for yourself? And I think in the professional world, one of the main criteria of success is the amount of money you earn. And I don't think you started off identifying with earning money. No, you started off by solving problems in mechanical design or in creating strategies for psychological help or whatever it is. And then it gets transferred to the social norm of measure of success. So again, it's the professional success. By the way, there's a psychologist at Harvard, at least it was, a fellow named Kagan, And in one of his books on psychology, he made a very interesting remark. He said, we are supposed to be the I generation, and we're supposed to be dedicated to pleasure. And the pleasure is what drives people, pleasure is what motivates people. But he said, it's certainly not the whole picture. And it may not even be the most important part of the picture. Let's imagine someone who has a summer vacation, is quite wealthy, and his vacation is helicoptering across Alaska. He and his family have a private helicopter. They go from place to place. They go fishing and swimming and doing the whole thing, right? That's fabulous, and it's unique, and it's tremendously joyful. And he uploads it to his Facebook page. Why does he do that? He's having the fun. He's enjoying it. Why does he have to publicize it? Because what's driving him is success. Not pleasure, but success.
And the validation from other people.
Exactly, the validation from other people. So it's because I managed to have a lot of pleasure, I will get the validation from other people that I'm a success, and that's why it goes up to my upload, to my Facebook page. Otherwise, what difference would it make? I had the pleasure. I have the memory of the pleasure. No, so I wouldn't say the pleasure is irrelevant to driving him, but success is very important. So again, it's measured in external terms. So this doesn't come from your identification. It may have been triggered by that, but it's sucked into that social context. That means that the job as a job is not being used just as a means. I remember seeing an article in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was 1999, anticipating the coming millennium. And they interviewed and analyzed the difference between men's attitudes towards computers versus women's attitudes towards computers. And they said women look at the computer as a business tool or a job tool, and they get the one that does the work for the job, and they use it for the job. A man could make the remark like this: I just got a new chip. On the old chip, my computer did 100,000 operations per second. Now it does 1,000,000 operations per second. My computer does 1,000,000 operations per second. Now, is that going to make your speed in answering emails faster? I don't think so. It's not going to change your output at all. You're not doing 3D modeling of wing design and various air currents, What are you doing? You have a spreadsheet, But my computer is more powerful now. It does. That attitude is not a female attitude. It's a male attitude. It had nothing to do with using it as a tool, but identifying, I have this item, and mine's stronger than yours. The guy says, my car does 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. You better not do that on the road. You better end up in jail. But my car can do it. I have that engine, not 200 horsepower, 700 horsepower. Yeah. That's a male attitude. And that's exactly what the book of Jonah is inveighing against. That if you would ask a person today, what are you? I am a servant of the creator of the universe. That's what I am. There are various things that I do, but that's what I am. That am has to be kept in focus. So one of the things that you focus on when you decide what profession to enter and how you apply yourself in the profession is, what will performing this profession do for what I am? I knew a fellow many years ago who became a doctor, and he said, I'm training to work in the emergency room. You know why? Because you work in the emergency room, you don't take anything home with you. You're not involved in continuing care. You give immediate care, and you pass them up to the wards that he goes to. You'll never be called in the middle of the night. You work your hours. I don't want that. I don't want to be, I don't want to take it home with me. I don't want to come home and be thinking about this case and that case and this therapy and that therapy. I don't want that. I want my mind to be free. He could work 30 hours a week, earn a very nice living. He had time for his family. He had time to learn. He had time to participate in the Jewish community. He's a person who planned his profession so as to be able to preserve what he wants to be. Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg, one of the founders of Or Sameach, worked in insurance. He was very successful. Got to the point where he accumulated a considerable amount of money, and then he said, well, I certainly have more than I could need for my any anticipated need. Why am I working 40 hours a week? So he cut it down to 30 hours. I don't need to work any more than that. Then he cut it down to 20 hours because he was doing so well. I have a friend, I live in Har Nof in Yerushalayim, this fellow came from America to live in Eretz Israel. He opened two businesses here in America. He had a jewelry business and he had a real estate business. And they were doing very well. He came to Eretz Israel in his 30s and stopped working. He stopped working. He went to learn full time. Then his children grew up. He had a number of daughters and he had to marry them off. So he back to working. The work served his life. The work serving his life, serving his identity, rather than being something which took control of his identity. This is a constant struggle. My mother-in-law, Allah Shalom, who lived through the Depression, as the people of that generation did, recounted to us something which I've said over many times. It was very wise. You know very well that during the Depression, people jumped off buildings. They lost their money and they committed suicide. Now, the observation went as follows. The Depression took place in 1929. Suppose in 1927, this person had lost a child. Lost a child. Would he have jumped off a building? Did you ever hear someone committing suicide because they lost a child?
No.
Certainly not. Now, if you had asked a person in 1927, what would be worse? Losing a child or losing your money? Of course he would say, losing a child. You could trade losing money for losing a child. He would certainly do that. So that's what he would say. But now look, it becomes 1929. He jumps off his building, leaving his children orphans. He could live by if he lost a child, but he can't live without his money. So really, what's more important to him? The money's more important to him. But he doesn't know that. He doesn't know that. He's not lying when you ask him and say, what's more important to you, your money or your child? And he says, my child. He's not lying. He doesn't know that the money has eaten away his identity, has eaten away its whole essence, to the point where he can't live without the money, whereas he can live without the child.
The money is the source of his power in his mind rather than his child and his family.
Okay, I'm open to...
Oh, no, I'm not disputing what you're saying.
No, on the contrary, I'm open to psychological explanations of these types. I think they're a little facile and they're often unverified, but it's a kind of game we play in interpreting things. I'm not commenting on that. I'm just pointing out that here's this self-deception is so deep that he himself isn't aware that the money has eaten away at his identity. Now we say in the Shema, you should love Hashem with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your possessions. And people ask, isn't that sort of anticlimactic? I mean, I'm already loving God with all my heart and all my soul. And don't forget your bank account. Wouldn't that be included? So I think part of the message here is precisely what my mother-in-law expressed. Yes, it could be that you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and therefore you think you love Him with all your possessions, but you don't, and you don't realize it. This requires self-analysis. This requires honesty. It requires ability for self-examination openly. It may require sharing thoughts and feelings and ideas with other people who may see you more objectively than you see yourself. Psychologists will tell you that you often don't see yourself objectively, and we agree. Adam Korovei Salatzmo means that you can't be trusted to render self-evaluations. So, one of the things that B'chol Me'odecha, I think, challenges us to do is to re-examine from time to time. What are we working for? How much are we working? What are we paying for what we're doing in order to account? And do we need everything that we're working for?
Rabbi?
Yes.
So I'm just curious, in Europe, where most of us came from, or wherever it is, we came a century or so ago, how did people, when they were making shidduchim, how did they value making a living? Was it, because in America, you see that, he's a doctor. Forget about everything else, he's a doctor, you gotta get that doctor. That's more in America, but how do we do it in Eastern Europe?
How was it done in Eastern Europe in terms of the relative importance of a profession in making a shidduch with people? I think it varied. I mean, I don't know much about the history. I'm about Shuvah like you are, so I didn't have it in my family at all.
But
But
based on what you're saying, it sounds like it's pretty important that shouldn't be number one. It comes in there somewhere, but maybe characters.
Okay.
But how was it actually done?
So I don't know the history, but I can tell you some general facts which I think are relevant and they contribute to the discussion as well. We understand that the Jewish people has special providential care that other nations don't have. And there are certain aspects of Jewish history in which this shows the very survival of Judaism for 3,800 years is unparalleled culturally in all of human history. That is in my book in some quite detail. But someone challenged me once and said, well, if I look at the median income of Jews, it isn't the highest in the world. There are other groups, maybe the Amish or others who have a higher median income. So I said, well, one factor you need to take into consideration is this, that from the point of view of our values, the number of Jewish multimillionaires doesn't count. There's nothing in our values that says that we should make as much money as can be made. You want to have enough for a certain platitude of life, which makes life not worrying, not threatening. But having more than that is itself a detracting factor. But let me explain this in a little bit of detail. Every time you ask for material sustenance from God in prayer, a word is used, the same word, sav'enu, cause us to be satisfied. Cause us to be satisfied. Let's think a little bit about satisfaction. There's a verse in Proverbs that says, Ohev kesef lo yizba kesef. Someone who loves kesef will never be satisfied with kesef. The question is, what does kesef mean? There are two explanations. One is that kesef, as some of you know, means money. This literally means silver. That can mean money. And the verse says, someone who loves money will not be satisfied with money. And the other explanation of kesef is mitzvot, commandments, spiritual activity. Someone who loves commandments and spiritual activity will not be satisfied with commandments and his commandments and spiritual activity. Now, time for a quiz. Let's ask, in these two meanings of kesef, is the verse stating a blessing or a curse? Let's think. Someone who loves money will not be satisfied with the money that he has. Is that a blessing or a curse?
That would be a curse.
That's a curse. The Talmud says if you have 100, you want 200. If you have 200, you want 400. My Rabbi said that means that the more you have, the more you lack. The more you have, the more you lack. Because what you lack is psychological. What am I missing? I define for myself what I'm missing. I don't have the Taj Mahal, do I? So I'm missing the Taj Mahal. Right? The more you have, the more you measure yourself in terms of lack, it means that you simultaneously acquire more and miss more. That's a terrible curse. On the other hand, if you say that one who loves mitzvos and spiritual accomplishment is not satisfied, will not be satisfied with what he has, that's a blessing. That's a blessing. A person who's satisfied with his spiritual position is a person who's spiritually dead. You're given the capacity to grow and to develop and always to climb higher mountains. And you just don't care. You're just, what you call it in Hebrew, adish. He's just so relaxed and flexible that it doesn't matter to him. That's spiritual death. So satisfaction is a two-edged sword. It depends upon what you're satisfied about. Okay, so now for the second quiz. The key verse that we say in Psukei Zimra, when we say in Psalms in the morning, you open up your hand and you satisfy, let's say, to all life, the will of all life, right? What are we talking about? Spiritual or physical?
It's a physical. If it's like for all life, and what's a spiritual life to an animal?
Okay, let's say it would say people. Good, that's a good observation. Sometimes kol chai means people. You satisfy the will of all people. Would that be physical or spiritual?
Could be both.
Could be both. Well, let's ask.
Will is intent, and so there's an aspect there that's not just merely material. Because
Okay, you're right. Both of these observations are correct. Let's put it back in the context that I just created for you. This verse in Ashrei, this verse describes something that God does. In context, is it something that God does to give a blessing or a curse?
Sounds like a blessing.
Blessing. Describing all the wonderful care that God showers upon us, right? Okay. So if it's talking about a blessing that He's giving us, the satisfaction the verse has to be talking about is satisfaction in
Spirituality.
If it's a blessing.
physical. It's got to be the physical. Because satisfaction in the physical is a blessing, and satisfaction in the spiritual is not a blessing.
Oh,
It's a
because
curse.
you stop growing.
Right,
You stop growing.
right.
That's right. So you see, this is how the mind works. These are all blessings that God is giving us, and all the wonderful things He's giving us. What's really important in life is spirituality. So it's got to be talking about spirituality. But no, it's got to be talking about physicality. That's where satisfaction is precious. Satisfaction means I have enough.
Yeah.
Then I'm not missing the next million. I'm not missing anything because I have enough. Now, the word enough has a profound implication because enough means I'm measuring how much I have against some need or some standard, and I'm calculating and I'm saying, well, okay, so I need 25,000 for that. I'm standing outside of it. And that's what makes it into a means rather than end. This is rooted in one of the divine names, which is spelled with a shin and a dalet and a yud, which Chazal paraphrase as She'omer L'Olam Odai. And the picture that's given is that when the world was created, it was expanding and expanding and expanding until God said, die, enough. No, that's not the Big Bang, thank you. First of all, it's matter and energy were expanding, it was getting more and more. And number two, and of course the Big Bang is only the expansion of space, not the expansion of anything else. And number two, he said it stopped, and it's still going on in our world, right? The expansion from the Big Bang. So don't give me precursors of the Big Bang. That's just not right. But when God, this name says the same thing. The world is expanding, and then God says enough. It means God and His purposes are standing outside this world. This world is being measured against His contribution to those purposes. That's the template of the idea that the physical world and physical activity is only a means. It's not an end. These are the ideas which support the principle that your profession is a means. It's a means towards an end. And as I said before, as I took from my wife, it's a means to as to what you are, what you be, rather than what you do. It's an activity which is to support what you are. As we said in the book of Jonah, what I am is a servant of God. Then I look at my profession as a means to that end. That's a way to reduce the identification with a job. We don't talk about eliminating, we don't talk about absolutes, but you can certainly reduce and put a limit on the extent to which you identify with your job, which is absolutely crucial. I have a friend who happens to be the son-in-law of my Rabbi Zatzal. He's the Rav of a very wealthy community in New York. And he told me, this was a test he gave me, he told me that some of the women in the community came to him to ask him for permission to go to work in professions. And he asked me, what do you think? Did I tell them yes or no? So I said, women have worked since the beginning of time. Jewish women have worked since the beginning of time. For many ages in history, if any member of the household didn't work, you would starve to death. Of course women work. There's no question about it. In some cases, women were the main support of the family. Look at Aish Chayil. You know, you sing it and you think wonderful about your wife, but look at the words. The words are all about how much money she makes and runs the household. That's 90% of what it describes. So of course you said yes. He said no. For many of them I say no. So why is that? Well, their husband's doing very well, thank you. They live in $2 million mansions in Flatbush, and they have all the money they could possibly want. They're going to work because they feel that without a profession, without those little letters after their name, MS or MSW or whatever the names are, without their names on the door in the office, without that, they don't count. They don't really exist. They're not really taking their place in the world without a profession. And he said, that's a wrong identification for a Jew. It's a wrong identification for a Jew. And then he said to me, you'll tell me that men also fail in this way. Men also come to identify with the professions and carry that mistaken identity. He said, that's true, but that's a man's responsibility. A man's responsibility is to provide for his family. He has to do that. And therefore, he has to face that problem. And he has to struggle with that spiritual problem. But it's not a woman's job to do that. She doesn't have to do that. So there's no reason for her to enter into that world and suffer that temptation. It's not necessary for them. If they needed it in order to support the family, by all means, you should work. But if it's just for a question of having an identity that you can be proud of, that's not appropriate. So all of this is designed to put your profession in its place. Now, this has a double effect. Number, what profession? For some of you, that's, I think, a bit passé. You're already invested in a particular profession. And then the extent to which, or the way in which you pursue the profession. I will mention the first category because it's real and it's relevant. You may be in touch with others or may have opportunities to adjust things. Different professions have different temptations. There's a gigantic difference between being, let's say, a lawyer and an accountant. I believe, from the experience that has been shared with me, every lawyer is asked multiple times to cheat. Put this in the contract. They don't know about this. They're not aware of this. You put these words in, written this way, they won't notice them. And then later in court, we've got them. You're writing a contract. They're signing it of their own free will. Are you responsible for the fact that you know that you're misleading them so as to trap them? And yes, maybe no. It's just one of these gray areas. An accountant. We had this expense. Put it on this year's account, not on next year, because that way we can get a tax advantage. I is coming next year. Yeah, but write it in over here because we need it that way. Dentists don't have those struggles.
Yeah.
Hope. I mean, I don't think
Sneak
so.
that filling in and charge them for it later.
That's right. Yeah. Put in chalk and say it's platinum. So if you're a person who can be swayed, if it's hard for you to take a stand, if it's hard for you to take a loss, maybe you shouldn't become a lawyer or an accountant. Maybe you should become a dentist or a plumber who can make much more money. So that's a question of choice of profession, knowing where your weaknesses are and how you have to prevent yourself from being compromised. But then there's how you push yourself. There's a fellow who became religious at the same time I did. He was at Harvard in brain physiology, and this program for graduate students. This wasn't required by the university. This is what they did. They lived in the laboratory. They had cots. They brought food to the laboratory, little refrigerators. It was 24/7. And the ethos was, we are going to become the world's leaders in brain physiology. It's worth it. It's worth it. And then he became Shomer Shabbos. And he said to him, you lost it. Too bad. Goodbye. You're not going to be one of these star Harvard products because you're only working 6 days a week, not 7 days a week. Well, he ended up in McGill as the head of a department in the university and so on and so on. I think he did pretty nicely for himself. Became a Chabad Chassid. And he did a lot of work with Bali Tshuva. And I don't think he lost out. But he said, Shabbos is more important. So I'm going to subordinate. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives success. Whatever success will come, he gives. That's the success that I want. I don't want more than that. And he subordinated his profession to the goal of what he wanted to become. And another fellow who became a Baal Tshuva, he became an ophthalmologist. And a couple of years after he graduated and started doing his medical work, he called me up and he said, I have to confess this to you, Rabbi. I feel terrible about it, and I've been embarrassed about it, but I have to tell you. I said, well, what's the matter? I'm thinking, wow, what could it be? And he thinks, I've given up my life's goal. Really? What was your life's goal? to win the Nobel Prize in Medicine. That's all. Just the Nobel Prize, right? No, that's all. I said, really? So what happened? He said, well, I got married. We're expecting our first child. And I asked myself, how am I going to be the father and the husband in a Jewish marriage? How am I going to do that? He had become Shomer Mitzvahs. I said, I don't know enough. I've got to spend time educating myself. Otherwise, I will not be able to play this role in a successful way. So he's embarrassed about this and worried about confessing this to me. You can imagine my reaction.
Yeah.
I was so happy for him because the life that he wants to build, the identity that he wants to express is much better serviced by spending the extra time learning Torah than working to compete with other medical advances in order to win the Nobel Prize. So that being the case, these are all examples of how the struggle is there and the need to take seriously the idea of subordinating the profession to the identity you want to have. Yes.
I have three examples of sort of a creative drive that somebody might have from youth that may not necessarily be successful. One is, say, a mathematician. My father, at the age of 9, knew he was going to be a mathematician someday, and he eventually became so. You have Haydn, who was a successful classical musician, and you have Van Gogh, who was a spectacularly successful artist, but not, never made it materially. And so if a Jewish boy has an inclination, a strong drive towards something, that doesn't necessarily translate into the means for supporting a Jewish family. How do you reconcile? I mean, my father eventually became a Columbia professor. As a mathematician, that's okay. I mean, there are means for that, but creatives have a harder time. I mean, there's lots of very talented musicians who are struggling to make a means.
Okay, so that actually, as you say this, I think I may have lost track of this question that was asked about Eastern Europe and how they use that level. You're talking about now creative people who often don't have the means to support themselves. So, first of all, what I meant to say about the history in Eastern Europe, as I said, I don't know the history, but I can tell you the values that they believed in. Being able to support a family is important. But the question always is, support at what level? Beverly Hills? Listen, I live in LA. You're not really a success unless you're in Beverly Hills. It's got to be Beverly Hills. So that's, at least $500,000 a year. And if not, or more.
Hancock Park.
But is that where you have to live? Must you live? What about Pico Robinson? Why can't you live in Pico Robinson?
Cleveland or
People are not
Dallas.
starving there. They're comfortable there. And then it doesn't have to be $500,000. It could be $450,000. Whatever it is.
Not
It
Pico
could be,
anymore.
instead of 9 days a week, it could be 5 days a week. So when you talk about the ability to support, this is the idea of having the blessing of being able to be satisfied with what you have, even perhaps at a lower level. And then, yes, there is a problem of your social standing, and social standing is not irrelevant because we're dealing now with psychology. There's a terrible slippage here between that's not a real value, and then you move to, and therefore it shouldn't be important, and therefore if it's important to you, something's broken in you and you should fix it. That's often unrealistic. It's just unrealistic. A person can't walk out of his house in the morning with confidence because he knows the neighbors are looking at him and looking down on him and treating him with disdain. You can't snap your fingers and ignore that. And there, it could be necessary, the Gemara talks about this, be necessary for him to work more hours so as not to feel the social disdain. Or to move, but the moving is hard and it takes time. It's not irrelevant to work for this kind of psychological comfort. It's not a relevant thing to do. Now, the extreme example of this is what happened in Europe in the middle between the two wars, where girls were not prepared to marry religious boys because they couldn't earn a living. The Beis Yaakov movement was started in part because in Poland, the Polish high schools taught quite sophisticated subjects. And the girls were learning these subjects, and they went to these boys who were studying in yeshiva, and these girls had no appreciation for what the boys were studying in yeshiva, but if the boys didn't know about philosophy and economics and politics and world history and so forth and so on, the boys looked to them to be ignoramuses, and therefore they weren't prepared to marry them. One of the motivations of the Beis Yaakov movement was for the girls to appreciate better what the boys have and be willing to accept it. Rav, I can't remember his name. The one who founded the Lublini Yeshiva, Moshe Shapiro, Rav Yaakov Shapiro. No, Rav Shapiro. I remember. I have a thing about names when I want a name. You'll remember. He set up a yeshiva which had a beautiful building, and he raised the money so the boys were well fed and well dressed, because he wanted the society as a whole to honor them. Now you think, what? You're going to honor them because they have nice clothes? But that's where it's holding. It's holding where if you don't have nice clothes, they won't honor them. And you're not honored by other people, you don't feel that you're honorable or worthy. You should be able to feel independent of that, but you can't. Psychology is real. It's not something which is irrelevant. And it's legitimate to spend money on psychology. If you want more sources for that, I'll be happy to supply them. So if you talk about being able to earn a living, that's a legitimate concern. A legitimate concern, it ought to be a concern on the man's side as well. But it's certainly a legitimate concern on the woman's side. Even today, when women with great nobility aspire to contribute to the income of the family, but they're not required to do it legally, and sometimes it's just not possible, especially in pregnancy, and especially caring for children is just not possible. So to have some kind of basis to believe that the man will be able to earn a living, a reasonable living, is a reasonable expectation. Now, when you talk about creative people, I think this is quite right. Creative people need to think seriously about earning a living, and today I think it's not so much of a problem because you're right about Van Gogh and other 200 years ago, 150 years ago, but today the practical application has overwhelmed people. I'm a philosopher. Almost everyone I have met who majored in philosophy ended up in law. You know, it's wonderful to think those sophisticated thoughts, but you have to put food on the table, and you're not going to do it in philosophy. So, and they're right, absolutely right. So but I think the principle is correct. The principle is correct. So I guess where we're at now is we talk about being satisfied with what you have. Part of the satisfaction is psychological satisfaction. Well, let me just illustrate this with a couple of examples. The Gemara in Ksubas talks about the mitzvah of charity. What are your responsibilities to support other people? So the Gemara quotes two verses, and the idea is you give him what he needs. But what he needs, and not beyond what he needs. Fine. Then the Gemara gives an example. It could include purchasing for a person with your charity money a horse for him to ride on and a servant that should precede him and announce his coming presence and help him with his menial needs. You think, charity money? In those days, to have a horse and a servant would be today like having a Lexus. Why would that be his charity? Why would that be charity money? And the Gemara says this is a person who grew up in luxury and now doesn't have it, and he feels incomplete, he feels undone because he doesn't have those resources. And you can spend your charity money on that psychology. That psychology is real. You don't say, but that psychology is twisted, it's abnormal, it's unnatural. Let him overcome the psychology. No. If he could overcome psychology, that's wonderful, and it may take years of training and so forth and so on. In the meantime, you could spend your charity money on it. Maimonides in the Shmona Prakim, his introduction to Pirkei Avos, the 5th chapter, is discussing doing everything for the sake of heaven. And he says, imagine how a person who did everything for the sake of heaven, how would he eat? He would eat food that's healthful, that's nutritious. And he certainly wouldn't be driven by the taste and the texture, which would lead him to eat things that are inappropriate. No, it would be dedicated to health. However, he says, there are people who psychologically lose the desire to eat. And as you'll see, this is not anorexia, you'll see from the therapy. He said, for those people, you have to hire the most professional chefs and prepare the most savory food, the most delicious food, so as to awaken their desire to eat, so that they will eat in a nutritionally satisfactory fashion. And then he says, in the same breath, he says, if a person is surrounded by the drab and ugly, he can become depressed. And therefore, he should invest in some kind of beauty so as to be able to avoid depression. And he ends his discussion with the following example. You would think that if you're doing everything to serve God, everything for the sake of heaven, you would not paint golden murals on your walls, nor sew golden threads into your clothes. That's what you would think. But as a matter of fact, there could be a time when purely for the sake of heaven, you'd sew golden murals on your walls and golden threads into your clothes. So the reader at this point says, you're kidding. What? That I could do for the sake of God? And he said, yes. If that's necessary for you to avoid depression, then you have to do it. It's appropriate in serving God to paint golden murals on your walls and sew golden threads into your clothes. I had a couple come to me with a problem, not newly married, they had 2 or 3 children, and they were both Bali Tshuva. And the problem was this, being Bali Tshuva, he didn't own a Shas, a copy of the Babylonian Talmud, which is quite expensive. They were saving up money to buy it. And before they got to buy it, the wife said, I want to use the money to redecorate the apartment. So he came to me and asked me, how can I convince my wife to spend it on the Talmud and not on redecorating the apartment? So I said to him, she's at home every day, all day, with your joint children. And she's telling you that the surroundings are depressing. Suppose she had, God forbid, migraine headaches. And suppose the only cure came from Switzerland and it was very expensive. Would you hesitate to spend the money that's dedicated to the Shas on the cure for her migraine headaches? No, because a migraine headache is a pain. She's suffering psychological pain. Why isn't that as significant to you as physical pain? Of course the money should go to redecorate the apartment. The Gemara says that certain types of operations to change the disfigurements on the face could be considered daki isha, could be considered the way of women, and it wouldn't be appropriate for a man to do it. He's having trouble getting through there. The door is stuck. Okay. So the question is, if it's considered to be a woman's practice, whether a man should do it or not. So the Talmud says, of course, if he's suffering pain, then of course he can't do it. And Tosfos asks, what if it's only psychological pain? He's just embarrassed by the disfigurement. Tosfos says, of course, psychological pain is pain. It's real pain. We don't ignore that. So if it's necessary to have an operation for that, that's permissible. So using money for psychological needs is completely appropriate. They are also needs. And if you are suffering that kind of psychological frustration, then it's appropriate to invest money so as to satisfy those needs, so that frustration can be overcome. So the question then is how to look at your profession and look at your earnings and your economic status as a means to an end. Now, this is not only a question, I'm speaking only to men, but this is a question, of course, of taking your wives along with you. We believe very strongly that all significant aspects of life should be shared between husband and wife. No decision should be made unilaterally, God forbid. No husband should come home and say, the rabbi told me, so this is what we're doing. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You come home, Jacob is with his father-in-law, Lavan, and Lavan's turned against him, and he's in danger, and God says to Jacob, go back home. Leave and go back home. So you know what Jacob does?
Yes,
He calls his wives out to the fields with him, where there are no spies. And he says to them, I served your father, I served your father, and he cheated me, and now he and my cousins have turned against me, and God said to me to go home. And he stops. He tells them this story. And they say, whatever God told you to do, you should do. He put it in front of them for their decision. Their words are very dramatic. They're almost spine-chilling. They're telling him to do what God told him to do. Does he need their agreement? Yes, he does. At least to the extent that if God told him to go and they don't want to go, they're not required to go. They don't have to follow him. He needs their free agreement. So that's an example of how husband and wife interact. If you feel a need or an inspiration to do something spiritually, discuss it. If your wife wants to delay it 6 months or a year, delay it 6 months or a year. Do not impose. It's just totally inappropriate. It's totally inappropriate. You have to share and share decisions and share priorities and to have trade-offs. That's the way a marriage is run. You're not cheating on God because that's what God wants you to do. It's so fascinating. There are things where by what the text says and what people do, you understand what God wants. God said to Moses last week, 2 parshas ago, he said to Moses, go down to Egypt to be the agent for the Exodus. So what does he do? He goes to his father-in-law and asks for permission. Really? You have to ask your father-in-law for permission to do what God tells you to do? God wants you to ask your father-in-law. We know that. We know that from what Moses did. God tells Moses, go and conquer this nation. Moses sends out messengers to offer them peace. From this we know that God wants us to apply for peace before we attack, no matter who they are. It could be the 7 nations, it could be Amalek. The Rambam says in the 6th chapter of the laws of kings and their wars, Hilchos Malachim, the wars of kings and their wars, he says you offer peace to everyone, including Amalek, and including the 7 nations that live in the land of Israel. First you offer peace. We know it because God told them to conquer, and he sent an offer of peace. That's what God wants. So there's a lot of things which you wouldn't have anticipated, and the tradition has to teach you that these are the kinds of considerations that God expects you to engage in, expects you to invest in. So that certainly you would want to discuss it with your wife. But I think this is the discussion that needs to be had. What does the money mean for us? What is the money doing for us? What's it doing for us? Put yourself on the pedestal and ask it to be contributing to what you want to achieve. What do we really want to achieve in life? Do we really need another room on the house? Do we really need the newest model car? Do we really need the vacation in Alaska? I mean, what are we doing these things for? And when they're done for social standing, so then it has to be recognized as such and rethought and perhaps adjusted. This is all part of the idea of having an appropriate place for a profession. Now, talk about trust in God. This is a big topic. We could speak about it for 6 months. I just wanted to try to articulate one principle which has lots of consequences. God is running the world. What happens in the world is what God wants to happen. The question is, why does he want it to happen? What are, so to speak, God's principles for deciding what should happen? That's very important to know, because then I know how I should interact so as to behave responsibly to get the things that I need. And one of the things that God wants us to do is to make an effort to provide for ourselves. No, there's no mitzvah to work. A person who says, it says for 6 days you should work, and the 7th day is Shabbos to Hashem, so God wants you to work. That's not true. If you inherited $10 million, don't work. Don't work. I used to say $1 million, but it's too little now. 10 million. By the other hand, the fact that mankind can't survive without working to produce its needs is something which God decreed on the world. But, says the Mesilas Yesharim, you have to understand there are various different types of decrees. This decree is a tax. It's a tax. Tax you have to pay in order to be able to survive. You don't volunteer to pay taxes. Shouldn't cheat, for sure. God forbid, shouldn't cheat. But you don't volunteer to pay extra taxes. So if God has arranged your life in such a way that you don't have to work in order to provide for yourself, don't work anyway, because that's volunteering to pay a tax. That's nuts.
What about like in terms of like having a purpose though? Like even if you inherit $10 million, you're not just going to sit on your tuchus every day. You know, you can study Torah and stuff like that. But why not work? It's like some people get enjoyment from both, from studying Torah and from working as well. Like why can't you still maybe a part-time job or whatever? Like you don't need a full-time job to support your family because you have $10 million, you said. But some people might still get enjoyment from that. I guess the Torah can bring you purpose as well, but why not a job as well? I guess.
Okay. If I were now,
it can, but I'm
Yeah,
sure that's what you're going to say.
Yeah, exactly right, exactly right. Your thought is evolving as you're talking, and you start asking one thing, then you shift it to another thing, and now you saw where the answer's coming from. That's very good. You have a self-critical.
But some people may not have the capacity to study.
Okay, so now we got stage 4. Okay,
right?
we're up to stage 4 already. Okay,
Yeah,
right.
So
And if
maybe
you
study
carry-
Torah half the day
I
and
don't
have
think
a
you.
job half the day.
I don't think you need me. You're doing the job yourself. You're doing a very good job.
So I asked the question.
Yeah. So if you have the $10 million, you don't want to be passive. You don't want to do nothing. But as you said, studying Torah, and not only studying Torah, but doing chesed, volunteering to help people in various ways.
Okay.
So you're not going to sit back and do nothing, for sure not. And then you talk about getting pleasure from doing things. That could be questioned. Is that really the criterion? What I get pleasure from doing? Maybe not. No, that's certainly not the criterion for everything I do. So then, and then Torah life, as opposed to Torah study. Torah life is much broader than Torah study. So that being the case, there's plenty of projects in Torah life that could occupy you and cause you to exert yourself and to be creative and all the rest. By the way, the blessing we make on Torah in the morning, the verb there is la'asok b'divrei Torah, to occupy yourself with the words of Torah.
Yeah.
So my first wife asked, imagine a person, he's a businessman, and a business deal is being negotiated, he stops and thinks, wait a minute, does the Torah allow that or not? This clause in the contract. He calls up the rabbi and says, listen, I'm negotiating, they put this in the contract, does the Torah allow it or not? And the rabbi comes back and says, yes it does, or no it doesn't, you have to change it, so on and so on. She asked, isn't he being osek b'divrei Torah? Isn't he occupying himself with divrei Torah? At his job, in his business, doesn't he count as fulfilling that blessing of occupying himself with his job? He definitely does. So one mustn't think that the bracha on Torah in the morning is for the yeshiva guys who sit to learn all day. No, it's for every Jew, all day long. Because your top thought in your mind is, what does the Torah want from me now? That's called being osek b'divrei Torah. I mentioned this to Rabbi Fried in Dallas, where we were on Thursday, and he says it's a taisus in brachas, where you have to remake the brachas on study of Torah at the end of the day, because you were not studying Torah in the middle of the day, and therefore you're coming back to the mitzvah, you have to make the bracha again. And the thought is, no, because you were occupied with divrei Torah all day long, even though you weren't studying a Torah book all day long. So, so this definitely opens up a wide field of endeavor that you could occupy yourself with without having to go back to making money, and that's what I sort of had in mind. But you spelled that out very nicely.
Well,
Yeah.
I was just going to say that, when the Rebbe was talking about, having asking why you're here, what your purpose is. If the person has a very unique and special gift, I think it would be, we'll just say wrong, to abandon it because they've reached the plateau of wealth that they don't need to work anymore. That this is their mission in life, whether it's that heart surgeon who saves lives or the professor who's imparting knowledge to students, that he should continue to employ those God-given talents.
Okay, this is a very important question, and it has certain subtleties that. So the question was this: you have enough money, but the way you earn money is through a gift that God gave you. Now, isn't it true that if He gave you the gift, you should use it? That's why He gave it to you. That it should be used appropriately. And even though you don't need the money, but it's a gift that you have, your heart surgeon or whatever it is,
And you enjoy it.
and you enjoy it. Okay, but there are several things here. First of all, maybe if you have enough money, you should be doing heart surgery gratis.
Gratis.
Gratis,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Don't take
Yeah,
money.
yeah,
Pro bono.
Then you have also the mitzvah of charity, right? Of chesed, of loving kindness. So you would increase the spiritual value of it. Not sure that people are jumping at that opportunity to do only charity work, but that would be a way of satisfying both. But the underlying principle that you are mentioning, I think needs examination. So if God gave me a gift, it would be sort of denying God's providence if I didn't use it. I don't think that's correct. It's very natural, it seems very logical, but I don't think it's correct. Let me give you an extreme example. That's how philosophy works. You go to the extreme examples, which are ridiculous but obvious, and then you work back towards the middle trying to find the criteria. Okay. So here we have George. He has two significant talents. Number one, being a prize fighter. He will win the Golden Gloves Award. He will be the top welterweight prize fighter in the world. Okay. He also could be a very good, but not top social worker. Okay. Now here is two life paths.
Yeah.
One is to become the welterweight champion of the world, and the other is to save marriages and to talk people out of suicide and to help wean people from addiction. Okay, a social worker who is better than he could handle 1,000 cases. He can only handle 850 cases. He's not really in the very top. But there'll be hundreds of people who will owe their lives and health to him versus being the welterweight champion. I think under those conditions, the appropriate thing to do would be give up being welterweight champion and be the social worker. I don't think it's true that God gives us abilities only to be used. Certainly with opportunities, God gives us opportunities to be turned down. That the real spiritual greatness is to turn the opportunity down, not to take the opportunity.
Rabbi, but what if you could make it a Kiddush Hashem for him to be the welterweight
Okay,
champion?
so now I can't resist this because I'm a logician.
You're stacking it.
You say you could make it a Kiddush Hashem, you've changed the case. Therefore, listen carefully, the word but is not appropriate. Because but means I have a continuation of discussing the previous point. You've changed the case to a different case. Yes, of course, there will be cases where it'll be different. There's no question about that. But that's not contributing
That's not
to the idea.
in the
But when that
hypothetical.
feature is not available,
Got it.
then it isn't
Got it.
is really justified. So I don't think there is a general principle that you should use the greatest ability that you have. I haven't seen it discussed at all in our sources, which makes me very suspicious. But here's a small example. Hillel, one of the greatest sages of the Jewish history, spent some time of his life as a wood chopper. Gemara says. Why was he being a wood chopper? So Rav Dessler says he was working on his characteristic of chesed, of loving kindness. And the way he would do it is this. Professionally, you can express loving kindness by undercharging. In other words, charging less than the true value of what you do. But then there has to be an objective true value of what you do. Intellectual work doesn't have an objective value. It's so unique that he could have become an advisor to IBM and worked 2 hours a day and earned a fortune. But wood, that has an objective market price. So he became a wood chopper and charged a little bit less than others. He didn't produce enough to undermine the market. He probably so that he knew he was giving more than he got. Now he wasn't in yeshiva. He was out in the forest chopping wood. And don't tell me he was learning mentally and so forth and so on. All of that's true, but it's not like being in the yeshiva. That's why it's worthwhile being in the yeshiva. He sacrificed the work he could do in the yeshiva, which was his greatest talent, in order to work on his spiritual characteristic of loving kindness. The Gaon of Vilna says, we are put in the world to fix our midos. That's why we're put here. fixing your midos probably doesn't express your objectively strongest talent. Your objectively strongest talent may be surgery, but that's not why you were put here. You're put here to fix your midos. And sometimes fixing your midos requires not practicing your strongest talent. So I speak under correction, and if someone sees the tape and wants to send me a source, I'd be happy to see them. I don't see that there's any general principle that you're given a specific capability that you have to exercise that capability. Now, I'm talking about extreme cases where you should just simply shift to a different capability. Very often, you can gerrymander your life in such a way that you use that capability. There is a Jewish principle, you should love God with all your heart, and the commentators point out that there the word for heart is really leif, lamed beis, and here it's lamed beis beis. So why is there an extra base? And by the way, the word leif in Hebrew does appear, even libcha appears, your heart with one, so it's not grammatical. So the Gemara says you love God with your good inclination and your evil inclination. That is to say, to take the impulses of your evil inclination and find circumstances under which those impulses could be used for good. And there are various techniques for this. So I teach this all the time. It's a standard idea. And one student said to me, what about being aggressive and combative? What about that? I was really good at aggressive competition. So I said, that's a good question. I'll go home and ask my wife. And I asked my first wife, and she said, let him become an advocate for victims. Mm-hmm. Oh, right. These are people who are being victimized, they're being disadvantaged, being taken advantage of. Become an advocate for them, fight for them. And then your aggressive combativeness will be serving a good purpose. So this is definitely a way of using your talent, but using it in such a way that it serves a Jewish value. That's a much better resolution than simply ignoring it. But my point in principle is that sometimes the right thing to do is to ignore it. That is the right thing to do. Because it doesn't have the appropriate Jewish value. You can have zero Jewish value or less Jewish value than something else that you might be doing. The goal is to ask what activity will produce the most value, both for the society at large and for my own spiritual self-development. Now, several people mentioned an idea which I want to comment on because I think it's central and important. That's the idea of pleasure. But I'll enjoy doing that. Okay. What is the place of enjoyment? What is the place of pleasure in Jewish life? You know the old adage, do whatever you want, just be happy. That's supposed to be a Jewish proverb. Yeah. I don't know that it has any source in our tradition. There is no mitzvah to be happy. There's a mitzvah to serve God in joy. There's a mitzvah to be joyful on the holidays. Also, there's a characteristic of joy on the Shabbos, not a mitzvah. We can talk about some other time. But the idea, just be happy, and joy and happiness are not the same thing. There is no such thing. Nevertheless, even though there's no mitzvah to be happy, there is an obligation and a requirement to be happy. Now you say, wait a minute, Rabbi. Don't the mitzvahs define your obligations? So the answer is no, and for the following reason. Because your requirements in life are to do mitzvahs, and there are some things that you need in order to be able to do mitzvahs. So if you're required to do mitzvahs, you're also required to do them because they're necessary for being able to do mitzvahs. It is a requirement and an obligation to sleep. I know people, especially new Bali Tshuva, who say, why did God create me crippled? 1/3 of my life, I'm not serving Him. I'm sleeping. Why did He create me that way? Angels don't sleep. Why did He create me that way? The answer is that you are serving God even when you're sleeping. Because since you need sleep for a mitzvah, if you sleep in order to be able to do mitzvahs, that's called service of God. In other words, service of God, avoda, outruns just mitzvahs. Ramchal writes this word for word. Yeah. Avoda has two dimensions. One is mitzvahs, and one is the necessities that are necessary in order to be able to do mitzvahs. And therefore, service of God is 24/7, 365, even though mitzvah is not 24/7, 365. And what you want to be involved in is service of God. And the service of God has these two dimensions. So, pleasure is service of God because it's necessary for being able to do mitzvos, and in particular, it's necessary for the quality of the mitzvos that you do very often, as opposed just for the quantity of the mitzvos that you do. I want to give you an illustration of this. This is something that I heard from my Rabbi many years ago. Zatzal. Joseph is sold into slavery. Jacob thinks Joseph is dead. Joseph is in slavery in Egypt. There's a famine, and Joseph reveals himself to his brothers and sends a message to his father: come down to meet me in Crete, and I'll support you during the famine. They come, they meet, they embrace, and the verse says, and he cried on his neck. Now, the pronouns are not totally clear. Who's who? Who cried on whose neck? And it's a different disagreement between the commentators. But one understanding, which I think is the majority, is that Joseph cried on his father's neck. So the commentators asked, let's see now, who was in greater distress? For whom is this a greater cathartic moment? Jacob thought Joseph was dead. He mourned for him for 20 years. Now he finds out that he's alive, and now he's embracing him. For Jacob, this is a gigantic moment. Joseph knew he was alive. Right? He wasn't mourning for anybody. He was separated from his father. Wouldn't it be more appropriate for Jacob to be crying?
Joseph had the empathy, though, right?
But he's empathizing with Jacob, right?
Right.
Okay, so my point is, Jacob should be the one crying. And Jacob's not crying. Right? Or both of them should cry. Why is Jacob not crying? So the Talmud has an answer. The answer is, he was saying Kriya Shema.
Wow.
Oh, wow, that's right. Wow, he's saying Kriya Shema. Boy, Jacob was very pious. You know, he's saying Kriya Shema. No, maybe it was that time in the morning. Just happened to be that time in the... Well, listen, you have 3 hours in the morning to say Shema. And even though our Shema is perfunctory and superficial, it takes us 3 minutes, maybe Jacob took a half hour, he chose that moment to say Shema. Why did he do that? That's a good question. Ask other people that question. See what you get. Rabbi Zatzal said as follows. In Kriya Shema, one of the things you do is you accept the yoke of heaven upon yourself. You declare yourself to be God's servant. You offer yourself to God, all of yourself. Now, how much is all of yourself? It depends upon how much you are. If you are more, it's a bigger offering. If you are less, it's a smaller offering. For 20 years, when Jacob thought that Joseph was dead, Jacob didn't have prophecy. He didn't have prophecy because he didn't have the level of simcha, of joy, that's required for prophecy. Jacob was less. He said Shema twice a day, or more, every day that Joseph was missing. But there was less in the Shema because there was less of him. Now he thinks, Joseph's alive. I'm going to embrace him. I will recover powers that I haven't had for 20 years. What am I going to do with those powers? I'm going to say Shema. I'm going to say a Shema that I haven't said in 20 years. The happiness, the joy of embracing Joseph, he said, will enable me to perform the mitzvah of Shema in a way that I haven't done in 20 years. Happiness can contribute to the quality with which you do mitzvahs. I don't know if we have a Mesilas Yesharim here. Probably not. In the end of the first chapter of the Mesilas Yesharim, he asks, he's talking about doing everything for the sake of heaven. That chapter is just like the Rambam's chapter in the Shemar Prakim. And he asks, what is the place of physical pleasure in serving God? And he makes a very profound remark. He says that physical pleasure can produce nachas ruach and yishuv hadas. Nachas ruach means a peaceful spirit, tranquil, and sort of quietly self-confident. And yishuv hadas means focus of your mind, focus of your attention. And he says those two psychological qualities, nachas ruach and yishuv hadas, are necessary to open up and empty your heart of any other concern than serving Hashem. And what brings those psychological qualities is physical pleasure. It's a very deep remark. So physical pleasure leads to tranquil spirit and focus of mind, which then lead to emptying your heart and opening it up to service of God. And that's where the physical pleasure can be, strictly in the service of God. So physical pleasure is important. It's not a joke, it's important. But it's important as a means to an end. There are many sources that talk about the importance, centrality of physical pleasure. I'll give you one more because this is something which you do dozens of times a day. As an example, at least 10 or 15 times a day. The bracha of Bori Nefashos Rabos, v'chesronan, you say after most non-special foods, the Tosfos in case of Mavarkim explains the meaning of that bracha. It's an astonishing Tosfos. Let's go through. Borei Nefashos Rabos, God creates many souls, v'chesronan, and what they lack, what they need. Glad you're sitting down. Tosfos says, you know what you need? Bread and water. That's what you need. You can't survive without bread and water. That's absolute bare necessities. Everything else, I'll call Mashabarosa. Everything else that you created, says Tosfos, is for Tanug Ba'alma, just for pleasure. Like apples, he says. They're created just for pleasure. Now, I'm going to finish it. Tosfos doesn't say these words, but I think in context it's obvious. How does the blood bracha go on? I'll call Mashabarosa, Lahachayos Behem Nefesh Kol Chai. To give life to the soul of all living things. That means stam pleasure, just pleasure, is necessary for life. If you don't have pleasure, you're not alive, says Tosfos. It's a very remarkable statement. And every time you say Beri Nefashos, you're celebrating that. He created these things for our pleasure. That pleasure is genuine. It's right. Now, you ask, well, what has that got to do with spirituality? One answer is very simple. I got this from my Rabbi when I started to become about tshuva. You eat an apple. You enjoy the apple. What's your attitude towards the enjoyment? If it's a divine gift, if you praise God before you eat it, and you thank God after you eat it, that apple is creating a link between you and God. It's creating God consciousness. That's a precious spiritual gift. The physical here is contributing that spiritual gift. So, it's because it's pleasant that you feel gratitude for it. So the capacity to feel pleasure gives, so to speak, the Kodesh Baruch Hu the opportunity to reach out to you and to create a link between you and Him by virtue of the pleasure that He gives you. So then that pleasure is playing a direct spiritual role. So that could be part of what Tosfos means when he talks about the life, the real life, the spiritual life of a human being is built in this way on pleasure. The Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, when he died, held up his fingers and said to Kodesh Baruch Hu, you know that I haven't had as much pleasure out of this world as my little finger. And that's true, even though Rabbi Yehuda Nossi was very rich. And it says that his table had on it all the delicacies all year long, and yet he took this testimony that he didn't have that pleasure. On the other hand, there's a Yerushalmi that says, when you come before the throne of glory, the end of life, you'll be asked, you were in this and this situation, and you had that and that pleasure available, why did you pass it up? Why did you pass it up? So you think, wait a minute, Rabbi Yehuda Nossi is declaring that he didn't have any pleasure, and now you're being told that you have to give an accounting of the pleasures you passed up. And the answer is this, that there are different ways to take pleasure. One way is when you have a pleasure to go psychologically internal and savor the pleasure. Talk to a wine taster. They have a whole Torah of wine tasting.
Yeah.
You know, all five senses, clink the glass and hold it up and see the amber of the light and sniff it, you know, and then roll it around on your tongue. What are you? You know, you're an albatross. You're an octopus. You're a chimpanzee. You're just wallowing in the pleasure, right? But if you experience it as a gift from God, your consciousness is entirely different. So it depends upon which kind of consciousness it is. Sometimes pleasure rips your consciousness away from God, and sometimes pleasure cements your consciousness to God. I think this is the difference. Rabbi Yehuda said, the pleasure that would distract me, detach me from God, I didn't have as much as my finger. I was careful not to have those pleasures. But the pleasures that can connect, after all, owning Shabbos means enjoying Shabbos, right? He didn't violate that mitzvah. He certainly performed that mitzvah. So, that being the case, the pleasure definitely has a role. But like profession, pleasure has to be firmly put in the position of a means, not to an end. And therefore, when you hear about people who deprive themselves systematically, they had a purpose in that also. Just as if they were missing a key philosophical idea of the Jewish tradition. This has a purpose. Deprivation has a purpose, and your life can be in a situation where you need to be able to handle that purpose. We have very great fear and reluctance to take an oath, a neder, a shvua. It's almost unknown for a person nowadays to do that. I know a person who was addicted to smoking, and his health was in danger, and he felt the only way that he could stop smoking was to take a neder not to smoke. I didn't ask a rabbinic authority. I can't testify that in the end what he did was right or wrong, but the Talmud does talk about taking an oath to prevent you from violating God's will in various ways. He took the oath and he stopped smoking. He used it for that purpose. So here, the idea is that there are general rules, there are general conditions, and then there are special circumstances where a person has to act differently on the basis of other Jewish principles. So we have to be careful not to judge the way people use the various Jewish resources. But in general, pleasure is a positive thing when you're careful to use it as a means to cementing your relationship with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. And this is what brachos do. Blessings are ways of connecting to a Kodesh Baruch Hu continuously. The Rambam writes this explicitly in Hilchos Brachos. The rabbis made brachos for very many life activities so that you'll be conscious of God continuously. Every time you think what bracha to make, there's a certain advantage in not washing for bread. I found, for me personally, because every time I pick a piece of food, I say, did I make a blessing that or not? Yeah, I made Rabbi Aish, okay, so I can eat it. I stop every time and think about that. That's not bad. That reminds me, getting to the end of the time, it reminds me of a story that I heard fairly recently. There was a Rosh Yeshiva whose wife went away for some trip, and one of the boys in the yeshiva was assigned to take care of the Rosh Yeshiva. And she said to the boy, listen, for lunch, sometimes he likes milchiks, so if he likes fleischiks, ask him what he wants for lunch. So he's asked him, and every day it was fleischiks. So the boy, after a few days, said, the Rebbe told me that sometimes you like milchiks. He said, I tell you, when I eat fleischiks, I'm meshubed to the Shulchan Aruch for 6 hours. I'm under the supervision and discipline of the Shulchan Aruch for 6 hours because I can't have milk for 6 hours. I want to be under that supervision. I want to be under that discretion. I want to be watching the clock. When can I have the coffee? Because every time I do that, I'm saying the Torah doesn't want me to have coffee now, and I'm not having coffee now. I want to be in that position because that way I know I'm connected. So the key thing in life is to be connected that way. And pleasure can be a means to that end. It's a means to that end. It has a positive role to play.
Or
So-
you put almond milk in the coffee instead of.
Yeah, you can put almond milk in the coffee.
Yeah.
I've tried them all, cocoa milk and all the rest of them.
And it's barb,
The cows still win. As far as I'm concerned, the cows still win. Anyway, I hope that this has opened your minds to a certain extent about the idea of profession. There's a lot of literature on this, both online and written. It's a long and complex subject, and at least that is a start. Any questions? Yeah.
Actually, as you were talking all through it, the question kept raising in my, not the question, but the statement in my mind, but I'm going to turn it into a question because it's a little bit of chutzpah in me for it to be a statement. Seems to me that a lot of what you're saying were categorized in a part of Mesilas Yesharim that for me was pivotal in understanding the entire book, and that was a chapter on pre-shoes. That
What
was
does precious mean?
separation.
Oh.
You have to take everything God allows you, you're willing to leave some on the table for him. You take every possible thing he allows you, you're telling him maybe he didn't give you enough, and you really wanted more, but you're gonna honor him, stop at it to the point. And in that chapter, Rob explained to me, sometimes you need to take that thing, and sometimes you need to not take that thing. And once I understood that question, for somebody, I understood all of the Mesilas Yesharim much better. My question to you is, the things you were talking about seem to be somewhat consistent with what I remember in that section of Mesilas Yesharim. Would that be a fair thing to say? Just for me to organize my thoughts on what you've said.
The things that I said were consistent or
We're
inconsistent?
consistent.
Consistent.
Somehow.
100% right. You're 100% right. This is a tough lesson for people to learn because our literature doesn't follow the norms that you would expect from the literature that you're familiar with. But general statements in our literature, I could say always or almost always admit of exceptions. You should look forward to the exceptions. And this is an explicit statement. Rabbi Yochanan said, Ein lemedim min haklolos. We don't rely on a general statement to cover every case. And then he went on to say, Afilu makom shenei b'chutz. Even when the statement you receive has exceptions listed, we don't rely on it that those are the only exceptions. There are other exceptions that aren't listed. The statements are meant as general rules, but always tolerate exceptions. As not a self-referential contradiction, because what I'm saying now isn't in the corpus. I'm speaking about the corpus. So for those of you who are logicians, don't worry, no, I'm not committing that mistake. If I did, I could have handed my card, because that was my field. So I think that that's exactly right, that whatever rule you're dealing with, there will be times when another rule will take precedence and cause it to be an exception. You shouldn't, because people trained in our literature, especially trained logically in our literature, you see all A's are B's, and then you come across an A that isn't a B and say, well, that's a contradiction. No, all A's and B's meant usually, most of the time, normally, but it tolerates other cases where it isn't so. Yeah.
A question, going back to what you said before about the blessings and the curses and the spirituality and the physical world of pursuing. So if like what you do gives, like you're talking about, you want 200, you want 400, right? You want more and more money each time. But is the way to kind of combat that if you're always trying to grow and pursue the spiritual, let's say you have like some sort of gift, like you write a, world's best seller, or you create an app, whatever, and you have way more, millions of times, you end up getting way more money than you need, right? But you don't, is the way to kind of combat that greed to like want more, like you're, whatever, the fifth richest person in the world, you want to be the first richest person, is the way to kind of combat that, to constantly pursue the spiritual, as well, even though you like have this gift that gave you more than you wanted. Do you understand?
I think you're right. One way to combat it is to constantly pursue the spiritual, but then there are ways to put it into practice. I knew someone in London who was very wealthy. You would never know it if you walked into his house. Rabbi Tauber in Muncie. I remember Rav Nata Schiller, who was the head of Or Sameach, first time he was taken there to us for charity, he walked in, they were waiting for Rabbi Tauber to make an appearance, and he said to his informant, this man doesn't have money. He can't give me money. Look at the way he lives. He gave him a lot of money. On the spot, he gave him $50,000. And then more, he gave him much, much more money. He lived very modestly. Yeah. So a person who says, I know I have $6 million in the bank, but I don't live that way.
Yeah.
And then he won't develop the need for the latest drapings and the latest statues and the fountains in the garden and so forth and so on, because he's resolved to live in a modest fashion. The first thing that I stayed in his house when I was in London. Some of the carpets were threadbare. Some places on the wall weren't completely fixed up. I knew he was very wealthy, but he chose to live in a modest fashion. So that's one way to set. It's not just spiritual pursuits like learning Mesilas Yesharim or saying Tehillim and so forth and so on, but how you use what you have. I'll tell you one thing to cap it, and maybe this will help also. There's something in our literature called Ayin Hara, which you've probably heard of, the evil eye. Rabbi Heinemann in Baltimore many years ago told us, what is the evil eye? That is where a person is jealous of what you have, and he prays to God that you shouldn't have it. And then it can hurt you. And then he said, why would God listen to a prayer like that?
Yeah,
You know, that's certainly
That's
a vicious,
my Rav asked.
that's a vicious prayer. And why would that have any weight? And he said, I'll tell you why. Imagine that you hear that someone wins a lottery. Those days, it was $1 million. Today it's $50 million. Okay, you heard it. Now, there are two cases. Sometimes you'd say, he won the lottery. Wow, that's wonderful. What wonderful news. And other times you'd say, he won the lottery? What a waste. What a waste. There's no reason he should have won the lottery. What's the difference? The difference is that the first guy uses his money to benefit other people, to benefit the population as a whole. And you think that's what he uses his money for? So then, yes, it's wonderful that he won the lottery. The other guy is selfish or cruel or vicious in what he does, and you say, that's terrible that he won the lottery, right? So now he said, maybe the guy's davening that this one shouldn't have what he has because of the way in which he uses what he has. That's why he's davening he should lose it. And that means it's his guilt that he's davening that way because of the way that he uses it. And then he could deserve to lose it. That's why how an ayin hara could hurt. Now, all of that was meant to answer your question by pointing out that what you want to do, if you have more money than you need, is to put yourself in a position where if you win the lottery, people would be very happy for you. If you use your money in such a way that people will be very happy for you, then that could be a way of making sure that it's not taking over your identity.
So-
yeah, that's right.
So what, the ayin hara becomes dangerous when it's deserved.
That's right. Exactly right.
Ah.
That's it. Very well put. That's
Yeah.
good. That's what Rabbi Hanan was saying. It becomes dangerous when it's deserved. Very well
Well
put.
distilled.
Yeah.
So if ayin hara is not deserved, like for example, money turns people against each other very easily. Like if there's one spot for a promotion, you have two best friends in the same workspace, but only one of them can get the promotion, and one of them gets the promotion. It may very well turn to jealousy, like, oh, I should have gotten the promotion, even though, like, so would Hashem dafka not listen to that kind of ayin hara, because there's no.
Well, it might be that way, but it might be more than that. You know, anticipating that could happen, each one could offer to help the other, to support the other, to enhance the abilities of the other, so that when it happens, the temptation to jealousy won't take place. I know you're on my side. I know you want my benefit. There's only one, but I know that you're not trying to put me down. You're not trying to cheat me out of it. On the contrary, you're helping me. We're helping each other. Then you could rejoice for the other person's success rather than be critical and jealous of the other person's success.
Like, help me get the next opening. Like, you're in
That's
there,
right.
you've got your foot in the
That's
door,
right, that's right.
and
Or you could say, now that I'm up in a higher position, I'll help you to be able to progress in your career. You know, you could make it cooperative. That way you would avoid the occurrence of the jealousy.
But the mice, there are people who do turn sour from those kind of situations.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. But again, it's and one says it's undeserved, but also there's a lack of preventative that takes place, which could create a certain amount of desert. Okay.
Scott, are there any other workshops for today, or is this it?
I think this is it.
Well, Kol hakavod, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's wonderful.